Brace yourself.
Let's do a little reminiscing before we get started. It's the year 2013. The 7th console generation was moving into its old age, while new information about the coming 8th generation was coming in quickly. The mainstays of the industry had already made their mark, ingraining themselves into the AAA market and defining the generation's identity. The downloadable indie market gained cultural influence alongside another integral portion of the industry, the open world game. While this wasn't the first generation to have open world games, it did show how integral they became over the last few years, especially in the AAA market. New franchises like Assassin's Creed and Saints Row shared shelves with the more venerable series like Grand Theft Auto, but we were also seeing the open world design philosophy begin to mix with other genres. One of these was the first-person shooter, whose open world spin was catapulted into the mainstream with Ubisoft's Far Cry series. With the release of Far Cry 2 and 3, Ubisoft melded an open world with the first-person shooter gameplay that Crytek delivered in the first Far Cry, leading to critical acclaim and defining the series in an entirely new way. But the series got attention once again once a mysterious Uplay listing detailed an odd new game in the Far Cry series, on April Fool's Day no less. This rumored standalone DLC turned out to be the biggest left turn the Far Cry series had seen yet. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, Ubisoft's neon-colored, drum-machined standalone DLC for their critically acclaimed open-world series, took us back to the future of 2007. But Ubisoft's development mindset made the biggest change to Far Cry, becoming a perspective that is terribly rare in today's AAA gaming industry. So here's today's thesis. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon condenses the elements of the open-world subgenre of action games into a digestible portion, limiting the repetition of the common gameplay features and, as a result, restricts the fatigue usually present in open-world games.
Just like that thing in Central America.
I'm gonna have me some fun.
Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon exists within a separate canon from the main Far Cry 3, following Sergeant Rex Power Colt, a cybernetically enhanced super soldier from the United States. Blood Dragon's story is a textbook action movie plot layered atop a smaller version of Far Cry 3's open-world map. Instead of a giant map to traverse for items and missions, Blood Dragon is considerably smaller, with fewer side missions, objectives, and collectibles. Other mechanics like shooting and stealth are almost identical to Far Cry 3, though some different weapons and goofy variations on local wildlife do strive for a unique identity. Blood Dragon's main difference is its neon glow synth booming aesthetic, fuel for the game's presentation, the game's most distinctive feature separating it from its big brother. When it comes to parodying a particular era and time, Ubisoft was smart to choose the 1980s as their decade of choice. Each decade has its own cultural persona. The 50s introduced black and white TV and the nuclear family, the 60s had the flower power of Woodstock. But when it comes to the decades of yesteryear, no generation had an aesthetic identity like the 1980s. The 80s were an unusually loud decade. The visual and audio elements of many of the cultural mainstays were bright, vibrant, and demanded to be recognized. Blockbuster action movies flaunted war, guns, and explosions. Fashion and interior design was full of bright colors and patterns. Music was resonant with twanging synths and bass beats. 80s culture took every opportunity to stand out, offering plenty of visual and audible features that were instantly recognizable and ingrained inside the decade's very identity. So using an aesthetic akin to that immediately identifiable decade makes a lot of sense, especially when it comes to parody, which Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon does at every chance. Crudely animated video game cutscenes, a constant neon glow atop the overworld, and a retro synthwave soundtrack all contribute to an indulgence on the attention-demanding aesthetic of the 80s, topped off with corny one-liners from a caricature of modern action movie protagonists. But as identifiable as this aesthetic is, it's not something approachable. While those who lived in the decade could find the cultural mainstays of the era to be endearingly nostalgic and, depending on your sense of humor, hilariously ironic, the common gamer born during the 90s or even the 2000s would be more difficult to appease. Parody demands a lot from an audience. If the audience doesn't know what is being referenced, the humor can't exist. So a relatively niche aesthetic direction is a risk that Ubisoft wasn't comfortable implementing into a game with the budget of Far Cry 3. But Ubisoft's proposed solution of standalone downloadable content is a very logical pairing. While Ubisoft wasn't the first to implement it, they certainly showed that standalone downloadable content was a functional business practice, one that allowed for more experimental aesthetics and an orthodox game design, but condensed length and lower income per purchase. But this sounds counterproductive. Taking an open world game and making it smaller and more compact seems like a total defeat of concept, the antithesis of what an open world game is meant to be. But I think the best way to explain this is to examine the condition of the open world game during that time period. While the subgenre blossomed with the success of games like Grand Theft Auto, it's begun to suffer from its own ambitions. Making a big open world game is about delivering an expansive space with the freedom of navigation and objective priority. There is a captivating appeal about big open worlds in games. As technology advanced the world to become bigger, size and scope is an easy way to demonstrate the power of new hardware, giving huge spaces and even more objectives to complete. The problem comes when the singularity is reached, when the world becomes too big. When a world is too large, navigation becomes a chore. Traversal, getting from point A to point B, takes up a majority of the player's time, robbing attention from the actual missions themselves. The tipping point is where the breadth of the open world is overtaken by the tedium of exploring it, where mindless padding is disguised as integral content. This is made even worse with slow, dull navigation. As popular as Grand Theft Auto is, its vehicle-based traversal has not evolved with the world size. Players spend so much time simply moving to objectives, or in worse circumstances, relying on fast travel methods, both of which defeat the purpose of open world exploration entirely. The open world games that I've ended up enjoying the most in recent years are games like Just Cause 2, Saints Row 4, and the Infamous series. These series' common link is a fast, exciting method of traversal across their open worlds. Even if the map is enormous, the fun of getting around in a quick, acrobatic way retains both a sense of player control and gameplay versatility. Even if you're simply scouring for pickups, the free-flowing momentum is preserved, and the padding doesn't meander into a murky mire of sluggish transportation. The most successful sandbox games have their mechanics evolve with their design, so making traversal fast and snappy is a fantastic way to compensate for a larger world that requires longer distances to travel. So what does this ideology have to do with Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon? Well, interestingly enough, Blood Dragon goes in the opposite direction. Instead of making movement mechanics faster, Blood Dragon makes its open world smaller. Since there is less distance to traverse, Blood Dragon creates the illusion of faster movement speed. The size of Blood Dragon's world accommodates the player so much better than a game twice its size can. Moving from the northernmost part of Blood Dragon's map to its southernmost part takes a noticeably short amount of time to complete, thanks to Rex's brisk movement speed. In fact, there were only a couple of times during my entire playthrough of Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon where I was compelled to use the game's fast travel feature. Complementing this condensed focus are individual shootouts that are placed on the map more densely. A simple firefight between enemies and allies is a common occurrence while exploring, as are the hunting of indigenous wildlife or encountering the monstrous Blood Dragon creatures. These random encounters are exciting and fun to experience, appearing to break the monotony of simply wandering around the map and keeping the shooting mechanics always on display. More prominent objectives like retaking fortresses for territory control or tackling side missions for cash and upgrades add extra activity, but even these are placed in convenient density. They're not too far from each other, and thanks to their glowing pillars of light, they're almost always within view. You can also obtain maps for collectible marking, and while the collectibles do suffer from the mindless tedium of other Ubisoft games like Assassin's Creed, so much so that Rex himself makes fun of them.
I hope I don't have to collect any fucking flags. 10 million credits to rebuild me and I'm doing this shit? Whoever thought this was fun? I'm gonna collect your head and put it on my wall.
This highlights the conciseness that the downloadable format provides the player. Earlier in this video, I noted the development of fatigue that has appeared in the open world genre, where the quantity of similar objectives eventually becomes repetitive and tedious. By serving its missions and activities in smaller portions and higher density, Blood Dragon doesn't suffer from that same fatigue. It makes objectives appear more frequently between traversal while also delivering them in numbers that don't feel impossible to achieve without extensive attention and time. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon all comes down to portions. It's a collective of familiar activities but presented in a form that doesn't overstay its welcome, nimbly avoiding the tedium and exhaustion that the open world design has cultivated as the genre evolved. Today, open world games continue to suffer from gameplay padding. Bigger worlds bring more empty space with their wider scale. The irony in this is that Blood Dragon is developed by Ubisoft. a publisher that's, in recent years, released some of the worst examples of bloated open-world action games. Ubisoft has commoditized the open-world game, fueling insatiable appetites to deliver endless empty calories to their game design. It's what's leveled the legitimacy of the Assassin's Creed series and dulled new IPs like Watch Dogs. Ubisoft is ultimately responsible for the decline in quality that open-world games have earned up till now. Yet Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is the polar opposite of this. It's fast, it's condensed, it's streamlined to a near-perfect pace, and best of all, it knows when to say enough is enough. As the antithesis of Ubisoft's reputation, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is the panacea needed to show the open-world genre in a much better light. All of its elements have appeared in Far Cry 3, yet by simply trimming down the portions, all of those empty calories no longer appear. With Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, Ubisoft created a solution to their own problem. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is experimental in both style and design. It delivers many of the same elements that traditional open-world games have, but condensed and concentrated into digestible bits of action. They're paced in a way to never reach the singularity of tedium. Burnout is kept away without jarring examples of broken immersion, while keeping the world interesting under the guise of a comical parody of the 1980s cultural icons. It's these smaller portions that synergize well with niche experimental aesthetic direction like 80s pop culture. Standalone DLC like Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon feels like a brilliant union of unusual presentation and intelligent fundamentalism of open-world gameplay. These two components operate best when joined together. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon's rejection of the most inherent feature of open-world games, breadth of scope, ends up being its greatest triumph. It protects its individual mechanics and design direction from erosion, and shows that more isn't always better. In the case of Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, just enough is better.